48 hours. That was all the time that separated a fragile ceasefire from the most expensive secret rescue operation ever carried out. And almost no one was talking about it while it was happening. While diplomats shook hands in Islamabad and news anchors called the event a step toward peace, American planes burned on Iranian soil. They weren't shot down. They were blown up, on purpose, by their own crews. Because the alternative, letting Iran approach a $130 million aircraft packed with secret technology and take notes, simply wasn't an option. 2 men were still out there, and the clock that matters in a rescue isn't the one on the wall. It measures how long it takes Iranian ground forces to surround a man hiding alone in a rocky crevice in the Zagros Mountains. This is not a story of heroism in the conventional sense. There are no slow-motion bravado moments here. What transpired during those 48 hours was cold, mechanical, and costly in a way that redefines how we think about modern warfare. It is about the true cost for a superpower to keep a promise. The promise isn't written in any treaty. It resides in the tacit contract between every pilot and the institution that put them there. We will come after you. It doesn't matter what the terrain looks like. It doesn't matter how many mobile SAM systems Iran decides to keep hidden. It doesn't matter the cost. The F-15E Strike Eagle that crashed on the 35th day of Operation Epic Fury was not the result of carelessness. It was the result of a very deliberate Iranian strategy they had been quietly rehearsing since they saw Iraq's air defense network collapse. In the first 72 hours of Operation Desert Storm in 1991, Iran studied that war. Then they studied Serbia in 1999. And then they built something that the United States would take 3 decades to learn how to counter and still not be able to completely neutralize. When the missile that downed that F-15E finally went off track, it wasn't a lucky shot. It was the end of a game of patience that Iran had been playing since the first American aircraft entered Iranian airspace. They waited, they persevered, and they chose the right moment. Both crew members ejected. One was rescued quickly. The other was not. And the difference between those 2 rescues, a few hours versus more than 50, is where the bill starts to climb. Because rescue costs don't increase linearly with time. They increase exponentially. Every hour a pilot spends dodging behind enemy lines is another hour for the threat to intensify, for search teams to close in, for a helicopter extraction to turn into a joint deployment of special operations that costs more than the aircraft that started it all. By the time the second man returned home, the United States had already spent hundreds of millions of dollars and left burning wreckage on Iranian soil. And the ceasefire that diplomats had negotiated for weeks hung by a thread, one that none of them fully understood. Iran didn't win a single air battle during Operation Epic Fury, not in the traditional sense. Fixed radars were destroyed, command posts were hit, ground infrastructure in several provinces was reduced to rubble in the first weeks of the campaign. By any conventional metric, the Iranian air defense network suffered a severe blow. But Iran wasn't playing by conventional metrics. The lesson they learned from Iraq wasn't build better fixed defenses. It was, don't build fixed defenses at all. Mobile SAM systems specifically, the SA-15, TOR-M1 became the backbone of a strategy built entirely around one idea: not being where the Americans are looking when they are looking. The TOR-M1 is an autonomous, self-propelled air defense system. It doesn't need an external radar. It doesn't need a command center to tell it what to do. It advances, detects, locks onto the target, fires, and returns to a mountain tunnel before the counterattack arrives. Iran had been practicing this cycle for years, and the Zagros Mountains, with their 4,000-meter granite ridges, narrow valleys, and a network of tunnels that would make any military strategist hesitate, offered terrain that amplified the advantages of the mobile approach. You can't hit what you can't find. You can't find what disappeared underground 5 minutes ago. And you certainly can't maintain ISR coverage over 1.65 million square kilometers, with enough density to track all the launches simultaneously. This is what made the rescue corridor so difficult to open. Not that Iran had overwhelming air power. They didn't. Not that their radar was unbeatable. It wasn't. But a jammed radar is a blinded radar, not a dead one. The moment the jamming aircraft moves or shifts frequency, the TOR-M1 crew can reactivate, scan, detect, and fire in under 8 seconds. A slow, non-stealthy rescue helicopter, transiting the kill zone at 150 knots, spends over 2 minutes inside an engagement envelope that needs less than 8 seconds to close. The math is not forgiving, and Iran knew The math. They kept one or two launchers alive, and hidden specifically for a moment like this, a high-value rescue operation that would force the Americans to reveal their electronic warfare assets, their insertion platforms, their refueling architecture. Shooting down the F-15E wasn't just a tactical win, it was an invitation to a more expensive fight. One where Iran could study everything the United States brought to the party. The EA-18G Growler squadrons launched from the USS Abraham Lincoln and began flooding the corridor with jamming energy. F-35CS flew top cover along the route. Every radar that emitted got an ARGM anti-radiation missile locked onto its signal at Mach 2. But the Torem-1 crews knew the playbook. Emit, fire, go dark. Wait, the corridor was never fully safe. It was conditionally survivable, which is a very different thing, and the helicopters flying through it knew the difference. They flew. Anyway, because the man in the rock crevice was still alive, still transmitting on his survival radio, and still waiting for the sound of rotors. The range problem sounds boring until you understand what it forced. The MH-6 Little Bird, the insertion helicopter, flown by the Army's 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment. The Night Stalkers has a combat range of roughly 230 to 250 nautical miles. It cannot refuel in the air. The crash site was 200 to 300 nautical miles from any ship in the Persian Gulf, depending on the route flown. A round trip, even on the shortest possible line, exceeded the aircraft's fuel capacity. There was no direct path. The little birds needed gas somewhere between the water and the mountains, and that somewhere had to be inside Iran. The solution was a forward arming and refueling point, a FARP. 2 MC-130 HOTA. Commando to aircraft would fly deep into Iranian territory, land on an abandoned agricultural airstrip, approximately 14 miles north of Shiraz in Isfahan province, unload fuel and equipment, and wait. The MH-6 South would fly from the ship to the FARP, refuel, push to the crash site, pull out the WSO, fly back to the FARP, refuel again, and exfiltrate. On paper, it was precise. The kind of plan that looks airtight in a briefing room under fluorescent lights at midnight. What the planning maps don't show is what 44 years of sun and drought do to agricultural soil in the Iranian interior. What fine, loose sand does when 74 tons of aircraft press down on it at landing speed. Both MC-130 J's touched down and immediately began to sink. Wheels dug in, neither aircraft could taxi. Neither could reach takeoff speed. 2 airplanes. Combined value, $228 million. Loaded with classified special operations, avionics, navigation systems, and communications gear. Any Iranian intelligence officer would spend a career trying to acquire these. They were stuck inside enemy territory with Iranian forces nearby. The mission commander didn't convene a committee or wait for guidance from headquarters. He ordered both aircraft destroyed in place. Demolition charges were set. At least 2 MH-6 Little Birds were destroyed alongside them. Some accounts say 4. Everything was reduced to twisted metal and ash before anyone on the other side could get close enough to read a serial number. That decision doesn't appear heroic in any cinematic sense. It looks like a catastrophic equipment loss, and it was. But it was also a professional making the only call that kept the mission alive and the technology out of enemy hands. The FARP was gone. The exfiltration plan had a hole in it. The Night Stalkers adapted. They flew the final leg at 15 to 50 feet above ground level, threading MH-6 south through Zagros Valley walls in total darkness. They used terrain masking to stay below Iranian radar coverage for as long as physically possible. No other aviation unit in the American military is trained to fly that profile at that intensity in that kind of terrain. The 160th didn't just exist for moments like this. They were built for them, piece by piece, training cycle by training cycle. They built this over 4 decades of nighttime flight hours that nobody outside the regiment ever sees. SEAL Team 6 walked in on foot through the Zagros rock fields and found the weapon systems. Officer in a crevice at 7,000 feet. It was Easter Sunday. He had been alone for more than 50 hours, evading, moving when he had to, staying still when he didn't. He was burning through the mental toolkit that Air Force SEER School spent years loading into him for exactly this situation. He was alive. He was coherent, and the moment the operators reached him, the most expensive personnel recovery in recent history shifted. The mission shifted from active crisis to extraction problem. That's not a small shift. Getting to a man is one thing. Getting him and everyone back out through a contested corridor, over terrain that punishes every mistake at 150 knots. Iranian, Sam Cruz are somewhere in the dark below, deciding whether this is worth revealing themselves. That's a different calculation entirely. Both men came home. The pilot recovered in hours by a conventional HH-60W Jolly Green 2 package. The WSO recovered in days by the full architecture of American Joint Special Operations capability. Growlers, Night Stalkers, SEAL Team 6, F-35C, top cover, a 10 close air support that absorbed enough damage to be written off completely. 3 services, dozens of aircraft, hundreds of personnel. One receipt that reads like a budget line for a small country. And 48 hours before diplomats in Islamabad were scheduled to discuss whether the ceasefire was still holding, American aircraft were burning on Iranian soil, and 2 men were riding home on the last helicopters that made it back to the ship. The ceasefire held. Barely. Iran accused the United States of violating it with strikes on islands in the Persian Gulf. The United States did not confirm the FARP operation publicly. The burning wreckage was documented by Iranian state media before the demolition team's charges had fully cooled, and somewhere in a classified annex to a report that won't be declassified for 25 years. The full bill is itemized line by line. What you just heard is the public version. The physics, the decisions, the cost structure of keeping a promise that no treaty requires, but every pilot counts on. Here's something I want to ask you. If you were the mission commander standing next to sinking aircraft, on Iranian soil, knowing what those planes contained, knowing Iranian forces could be 20 minutes out, what do you order? You don't have to be a military expert to have an opinion. Drop it in the comments. Primera rea de them. This community has had some of the sharpest takes I've seen. Your perspective matters here. If you've made it this far, subscribe. There's more coming that you're going to want to see before it hits the mainstream. If you have a story, bring it to the comments. That's what this community is for. We build the picture together.